So let's do question of the day. Question of the day. Kelly?
Who created the first fonts to work with both in maps and PCs?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Who created the first fonts to work both with maps and PCs?
Okay, go ahead, Cassie.
Matthew Carter.
Matthew Carter is correct. Anything else we want to say about that?
The fonts were Urbana in Georgia.
That's correct. That's correct. Why was this a problem? Why did Matthew Carter create this situation where the fonts could be used on both platforms? Go ahead.
Because up to that point, the developers had been using their own fonts, so even though it's technically the same internet, they had their own specific things, so things can look really nice on one platform, but then not on another.
Very good. Yes. So we came to this situation because the operating systems were different between PCs and Macs. The way that they looked came out very different from one kind of computer to the next. So who's got another question of the day? Go ahead, Liz.
Why was the pushpin influence named accordingly?
Why was it called the pushpin influence? What do we call that? The pushpin influence. If you actually watch the movie Helvetica, there's one or two designers there that say that pushpin had a profound influence on them. Why was pushpin so influential? Really? Nobody's got an answer for why pushpin was so influential? Go ahead.
It's a Russian thing. It's like more than that. It's like, see, God. Is this a thing where everybody's basically going up? They instead of using like frames, they just push pin their stuff to the wall. Okay, no, all right. It's a pushpin's Russian, so it's like, okay, I'm grasping straws here.
Grasping. Anybody else want to try? Why Pushpin was such an influential organization, influential firm? All right. Well, you might have a different answer, but my answer is that Pushpin was influential because they reintroduced the idea of illustration back into design. Whereas all these modernists had been pushing away from illustration. They had been making illustration even more and more simplified to the point where it was just kind of like, all right, let's say it in as minimal way as possible. And Pushpin reintroduced the idea of realistic illustration. They introduced the idea of caricatures. They reintroduced the ideas of full spectrum images and gradient screens and all of that stuff into it. But they weren't doing it in the same way that the populists had done it in the 1950s. Is that correct, or is that okay? So, did you have a different answer?
I was going to say something along the lines of like they were rebelling against the modernist stuff.
Yeah, no, and the modernist stuff was really pared down illustration. So, yeah, I gave you a couple of points for that, though, because nobody else came up with an answer. Come on, guys. One last question of the day. Go ahead.
Who designed the Apple logo?
Who designed the Apple logo? Ooh. Go ahead.
Was it Robert Janoff?
That would be correct. Janoff? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Have anything else that you want to say about it, though? Opportunity to add something into this conversation about
It was
that.
originally like rainbow colored.
Okay, even before that, anybody
It
remember?
was like
okay.
the apple with like Einstein or whatever, like falling on his head.
Newton.
Or Newton, my bad.
Yeah.
My bad, I can remember. So, but it was the idea that like he got the idea after being hit on like that or whatever. I don't know. Did they ever like keep that, or was it just like a prototype?
No, that was their original logo.
Oh, okay.
They used it for their very first like packaging and branding, if you will. Can you tell us why they chose a rainbow? Do you know why?
Like the colors on the screen.
Okay, that's part of it. Why else? Anybody else? Anybody else have a comment? What do you think?
Because like all the other major tech companies like Monochromatic and Dark.
Okay.
Like, IBM was like Navy, and a lot of other similar tech companies were just a single dark color.
Sort of. What do you think, Anne?
this sort of goes back more, our artist did Steve Jobs' autobiography a while ago, and basically he was in his garage with Wozniak, and basically Steve's dad said to him, either sell this or get rid of it. So that's how it kind of sprung. That was sort of the.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
why the rainbow colors? What do you think, Cassie?
Is it about the story, like if you bite the apple, get knowledge, is like knowledge
That's
color?
the one. That's the one. Yes. So it's like, okay, suddenly the world is full of color. Suddenly the world is no longer the black and white prism of the PC landscape. Now you're suddenly blossoming into color. So that was the reason why the rainbow colors. That's okay. I give lots of points away for all of the different answers that we did. So just to remind you why we're doing this question of the day thing, it's that you guys can get extra points. So every time you ask a question, and you answer a question, and you stump the group, you get a certain amount of points, and at the end of the semester, everybody that's participated gets points. I demand that you guys have at least 3 times that you've participated in this, but once you get past that 3 points, everybody's getting points that they can add up towards extra credit at the end of the semester. So whoever's answered the most gets the most points, and then it cascades down from there. So I can't tell you who's in what order or how many you'll see when you get your grades, but if you answer the question more times than not, then you got more points. So, okay? Got it? We're diving into this. I should also say that our final exam on our syllabus had said to be determined. I checked it out. We're in block 4, which means that Monday and Wednesday our class starts at 1 o'clock, and that means that we're pushed, for this class, the exam is pushed to a week from Wednesday. That would be the 8th at 1:45 to 3:45. That's the testing period that we have for this particular class. So be here, be square, 1:45 to 3:45 on next Wednesday. It will take place in this classroom, okay? So unless you have extenuating circumstances, and that can't happen, but they set it up so that if you're taking a 16-week course, that it shouldn't interfere with any of your other classes. That's how supposedly they have it worked out. I have no idea. All right, so thank you, Kelly. All right, so we're going to jump into the different kinds of styles that are associated with postmodernism. And the first style that we want to talk about is called New Wave typography. Interestingly enough, the first 2 of these postmodern styles, New Wave typography and then the California Memphis style, they're based off of the Swiss design theory, the Swiss design ideology. So when we look at them, we have to recognize that the things that were applied to Swiss design are really kind of applied to these as well. We just, they're being disguised. They don't necessarily look like what they had originally looked like back in the day when they were Swiss design. So, but the foundations, the thinking, everything that goes along with Swiss design is still being applied here. So that means that using grids is being utilized, using sans serif typography still being utilized, thinking asymmetrically, that's still being utilized in this new wave typography. So that influence is still there. We still have a grid. Type, however, is changing. So instead of having these very simple, uncomplex layouts with the typography, now the typography is going to become very complex. So the Swiss designers were famous for choosing one weight of font and maybe 2 point sizes. Now we're going to see a whole variety of them. Now we're going to see the type becomes textural, meaning that it starts to letter space out, that weight sizes or weights change, that size shifts. In the way that they're doing it, and they start to incorporate new elements into the design. So things like zigzags or organic shapes, stair stepping, a lot of tension happening, a lot of overlapping elements, vertical typography. All of those things start to add in. So here's an example of new wave typography. And the person that we want to give credit to for this immediate push away from the Swiss design methodology is a guy named Wolfgang Weingart. Now, interestingly, he was a student at School of Design Basel. No extras of the, any extras, thank you. He was a student at the Basel School of Design, which is the leading school for Swiss design. Where Armin Hoffman was one of the instructors at the school. And going to the school, he found himself really bored with the standard traditional way of doing Swiss design. It had become kind of old hat at that point, and as far as Wolfgang Weingart was concerned, he saw that everything looked the same. He really felt like there was no personality in any of the things that they were doing. And so he immediately started to try to work within the confines of what the instructors were telling him that he needed to do, using all the rules of Swiss design. But then he started to push those rules. So here we go, back into rebellion, people wanting to do something that was obstructive a little bit. So he was trying to find ways to work with the Swiss design methodology, but at the same time to push the edge on what Swiss design could be. And these are some of the designs that he came up with. His professors, he thought for sure, they're gonna like kick me out of the school. They're gonna say, oh, you're not following the rules at all, this is bad. Instead, his professors said, do you want a job? So they recognized that things were changing, that attitudes were changing, and that Wolfgang Weingart was right there at the forefront of what these changing attitudes were about. And so they brought him in, and he became a new type instructor at the school, and started to show students how they could start to push what the norms of Swiss design were. So again, just recognizing there are grids. They're not very visible, but there are grids in the way that the designs are worked out. They're still using sans serif typography, just like they have with the traditional Swiss design. But now Wolfgang is introducing other elements into it, like the incorporation of images. He's starting to put those into the pieces that he's doing. He's starting to letter space, let words out, or add weight into the characters. He's not afraid to turn things diagonally or vertically in order to create things. And so again, if we were to dissect this, we would actually see that there's a grid structure underneath everything that he's doing. It's just it doesn't resemble Swiss design anymore. And a lot of young designers were really excited by this because we're in the 1960s, early 1970s, and this is the age of rebellion, where we have hippies and all these young people that are pushing against the norms. And so what Wolfgang Weingart is doing here is really kind of touching upon the vibe of this generation. So he became a very noteworthy teacher at the Basel School of Design. As a teacher there, he came across a number of other students that he in turn influenced. One of them was a young woman named April Breiman. Now, the benefit of knowing April Breiman was that she was an American, American designer who was going to Basel School of Design to get her graduate degree. So she chose to go to Switzerland to do this, and she too encountered the same thing that she found with Wolfgang Weingart encountered. All of those classes, those traditional classes about laying things out on grids and all of that stuff, was incredibly boring to her. She hated it. But as soon as she took Wolfgang's class, she felt like she was suddenly freed, that she was able to start doing things in ways that none of the other instructors were doing. So when she came back to the United States, moved back to California where she was from, she started to apply these design traits, the things that she had learned at the Basel School of Design, into the things that she was doing. And for many Americans, this is the first time that we had encountered these radical kinds of thinking that the new wave typography was really about. She was also really ahead of the curve as far as what the computers were doing. So when the Macintosh computer first came out in 1984, a lot of people, if they had one in their office, and it was about $1,000 to buy one of those little contraptions with less than 1 meg of memory on them. And most people can do much with them. They found that it wasn't really the memory, but it was the output. Once they output things, they really like, okay, so what am I supposed to do with this? And am I supposed to send a file to a printer and they're supposed to rip this apart for me? How am I supposed to work with this? And so they found that it really wasn't very conducive for them. So instead, most people were deserting their Macintosh computers, not working with them. April Greiman was different than that, though. She saw that the computer had capabilities to go way further than what anybody else was playing with them, and so she started to use it for typography. Now, in those early days, the typography was really horrible on the computers. It only came with a handful of fonts that were available to work from, and the ones that were there were very bitmapped out. They were not the elegant fonts that we see on our computers now. They weren't even Georgia Verdana. At that point, they were just these really horrible bitmap fonts. And April Greiman, instead of like poo-pooing them like every other designer in the industry was doing, she said there's a beauty in the ugliness of these fonts. And so she started to capitalize on them. And instead of trying to use them like anybody else would as regular body copy, she chose to expand them and turn them into headlines and really take advantage of the ugliness of this. Further, this is still in the times when people were laying things out mechanically, meaning key lines, meaning that if you had another color, that you put an overlay over top of a key line to mechanical board. Art was tactile. Mechanical's design was tactile. You actually touched it with your hands. You actually, those skills that we teach you in some of these classes of actually using paper and pencil, they used paper and pencil all the time in those days, or they used ink, real ink, on paper. They drew art. And so anytime that you wanted another layer, you had to put an overlay or a transparency on acetate and glue it down onto this acetate, and then the printing company would separate everything else and put everything out and put things together. It was a pretty amazing way that they went about it. It's not like how we do it now, where we have layers that are built into our software and we can see everything all laid out at once. You had to visualize this stuff back in the day, and you had to know how to mechanically do it. And if you were doing something where you had transparencies, or you had one color overlaying over top of another, that took a lot of brain work to get there, because mechanically you couldn't do it the way that we do it on our computers now. But she was ahead of it. She was doing stuff like this before the computer had the capability to do layering features. So she understood computers. She was also like on the cusp of understanding this new California Memphis style. This really looks more like the California Memphis style when we look at it and we recognize it. But she was incorporating all of those things that we kind of see in that style, the stair stepping and the typography that's going at angles and all of these weird shapes that are incorporated. But again, there's a grid, there's a structure to everything that she's doing. So overall, very unique stuff, and again, for many, many people, this was very extreme. They have never seen anything like this. Think about the difference between what Paul Rand was doing, who is also still doing design at this time, and what April Greiman is now doing, what Saul Bass was doing, or what Alan Lustig were doing, and compare them to what April Greiman is doing just a few short years later. And it's really pretty amazing. Or even think about some of those Swiss design posters that we looked at with Joseph Mueller-Brockmann or Armin Hoffman, and how their posters looked in comparison to what April Greiman was doing here. Very unique. Probably the thing that was most groundbreaking among the things that April Greiman did was this. It was a layout that she did for a magazine, a publication called Design Quarterly. And they asked her to do this because she was getting so much attention for her designs in California, and how people were starting to pay attention to this new wave typography. They were starting to actually call it new wave, or even not grunge. They were starting to call it punk. The design that she was creating, because of the attitude that it had, and how different it was from anything else. But again, being ahead of the curve, understanding the technology, she decided to do this issue that she was assigned all on a Macintosh computer. Nobody else had done this before. And she decided that she was going to do it so it wasn't a magazine that you lay out page by page by page, but instead she turned the magazine into a poster. So the layout was structured so that on one side you would have one image on the front, and then when you flipped it over, you'd have a different image on the back side. And it was really the magazine that would be folded up into the size of the magazine when it was all done, and you would have it as this contained same size as what the magazine is, and when you opened it out, it looked like this. The images of her and her body. And she composed everything within the computer. Again, thinking about those original Macintoshes with less than 1 megabyte of RAM available on those computers, this is a pretty amazing task to do. And it was a real memory hog. But there weren't any other computers at that time. The computers did not come with more memory, bigger RAM. They hadn't developed that yet. So she was forced to work within the limitations of what the computer could do. So oftentimes she would spend her day working on what her layouts were, trying to save as she went along. And then at the end of the day, she would send the layout to rip off onto the laser printer that she had in her office. And it would literally take from the time that she hit the send button at the end of the day until she came back into the office the next morning for it to complete that rip cycle. So it took all of that time for it to send to the printer and to print out in that configuration of time, good 12 hours later. Yes.
What was the school that she went to again?
The Basel School of Design. Basel School of Design. So the front side is, again, imagery, self-portraiture that she did at the top. And the bottom is actually really incredibly tightly written notes about how she did all of this. She did some screen caps from videos and inserted them into this. And so it was really, again, very amazing, the process that she went to and how much she put into this project.
Is that early Photoshop? That the early versions of them, trying to think back my mind when it was introduced.
I do not know what software she used to
Okay.
put this together. I really can't say.
You
I
don't
can
know,
say
it's
that if it was Photoshop, it was a very early iteration of Photoshop. Certainly does not have the capabilities that we have now. InDesign did not exist at this time. Illustrator was in its early days, and it was competing with another software called Freehand. So those two kind of went side by side and were competing with each other, two different companies. PageMaker was, later on, PageMaker was the predecessor to what is InDesign, and PageMaker was competing with a company called Quark. And Quark, eventually by 1990 or so, had market share. It was the big software, and PageMaker was dog shit, if you will. It was really a horrible software. Nobody liked it. But in any case, that was even before this. I have no idea what the software was that she was working with on this. She was not alone as being an American that came to the U.S. and was peddling this kind of new wave typography. Another guy named Willy Kuntz, he was actually not American, but he was Swiss-born, but he ended up coming to the United States. Willy Kuntz also studied at Basel, same time that April Greiman did. He ended up moving to New York City in the 1970s, and then he was applying the stuff that he learned in Wolfgang Weingart's class also. So he was considered very cutting edge as far as this new wave typography goes also. In his particular case, though, he was actually asked to come back to Basel when Wolfgang Weingart went off on sabbatical. So most instructors, when they go off on sabbatical, it's like every so many years the administration tells them, you need to take a sabbatical, you got a year or 2 years off, and you're supposed to do research in that time. And so while Wolfgang Weingart was off on sabbatical, Willy Kuntz came back and taught his typography classes for him. And Willy Kuntz decided, this is great, that I have this opportunity to work with these designers who I can train under this new methodology, this new style, and I can also use this to show Americans what this new style is. So he put his students to work in building all kinds of type exercises that they did. And he assembled a book from the type exercises that he had them working on, and he called it 12 Typographical Interpretations. And the stress here is on the way that the words are spelled out. So it's 12, and then typo, meaning mistake, and then graphical, graphics, and then interpretation. So it was spelled out that way, 12 typographical interpretations. And he published a book like this, and it sold really well in the United States for everybody that was interested in this new style that's coming to the forefront in the design world. When he came back to the United States, he continued on working as a designer designer. This poster won lots and lots of awards at the time because it was so unique and fresh and different from what the standard Swiss design looked like or what the stuff that they were seeing out of modernism at that period of time. It's something that we need to make sure that you understand is that people didn't know we were transitioning out of modernism and into postmodernism. They just knew that everything that they were seeing was somehow modern. And it took a number of years, about 10 years or so, from the 1970s to the mid-1980s before people really started to call this postmodernism. And they certainly didn't know to call it new wave postmodernism. People weren't even sure if new wave was a form of postmodernism at that time. They thought maybe this is a completely different tangent. So nobody really understood where we stood in historical perspective. Now we understand it. And when Willie Kuntz was coming back, this was very fresh, very unusual for a lot of people. One of the things that Willie Kuntz did really well was understanding the grid and the relationship to the grid. And so that's why a lot of people that were part of the Swiss design methodology really glommed onto what he was doing, because he made, instead of like what Wolfgang Weingart was doing, or even Ava Breiman were doing, where they were taking things and exploding images and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, Willie Kuntz was a little bit closer to adherence to the Swiss design methods. However, unlike what the Swiss designers did, where they created a grid first and then they adhered to the structure of the grid, in Willie Kuntz's case, he created the layout first and then reinterpreted the grid based upon that. So he used his layout that he did in his original sketches, and then he would apply a grid to it or draw the grid around that. And so over and over again, there's kind of a unique and fresher look to the way that he's approaching this, so it doesn't look as tight or confining or constraining as what the Swiss design stuff did. And at the same time, it also starts to evoke a sense of personality, so you can start to see Willie Kuntz's personality coming out in the work that he's doing, just like Wolfgang Weingart's and Ava Breiman's are. Again, but not quite to the same extreme radicalism that we saw with Ava Breiman or Willie Kuntz. I'm sorry, Wolfgang Weingart. So that's new wave typography, and that's the first of the styles. And then we have another style that was influenced by this new wave, and at the same time by Swiss design. And we call this one the California style, we call it Memphis style. For a while, people just called it postmodern. They just call it postmodern, thinking that everything that this group was doing was the same as what New Wave was. So it took a while for people to catch on to the idea of what this California style is. We call it California style because the people that were playing with this version of postmodernism, most of them were from California. And the color palettes that they chose were very reminiscent of a color palettes that we were seeing over and over again in California. But it was also called Memphis, and the reason why it was called Memphis was because there was a design group called the Memphis Design Group, and they played with this. Now the Memphis Design Group was not actually from California or Tennessee or any other likes. They were actually out of Italy, but they liked that name Memphis, and so they stuck with it, and the things that they were doing that became the namesake of this group. So California or Memphis, those words are interchangeable. We can use either one of them to describe the same thing. What we see in that is the idea was born out of this new wave philosophy of pushing the extremes of grids, pushing the extremes of shapes. For the California or Memphis artists, they were playing with these bold colors that were, again, reminiscent of California, or even the pop art colors. The colors that we see in the Memphis style we're going to recognize are the same colors that we saw in the psychedelic pieces. So this idea of these conflicting, largely saturated colors are incorporated into them. Scale and texture are very much incorporated, just like we have in New Wave, the idea of scale and texture being incorporated there. But the stuff that we see come out of this Memphis style, California style, is definitely more structured to a grid than what we saw from a lot of the New Wave. Willie Kuntz is probably the exception. His stuff is pretty tied to a grid. But for the California style, we definitely see grids being utilized. Also for the California styles, they started to push away from this notion that the Swiss designers had of only using sans serif typefaces. So for the California Memphis style, they started to incorporate classic serif typefaces back into the work. So they no longer felt that you had to, that sans serif was the only way to go. Now they were starting to say, well, what about Garamond? What about Baskerville? I like those fonts. How come we can't play with those? So they started to do it. And really, what's at the heart of what the California Memphis style designers are doing is a commentary on consumerism, on this plight of consumerism that we have going on. So I've shown you guys before the work of Michael Graves as an architect. Michael Graves was also stepping into the industrial design forefront and designing products. Industrial design is a form of design where you're designing things like tools, or you design the body of a washing machine, or you design the way the vacuum cleaner looks, that type of thing. They design products. And so Michael Graves started to do that kind of thing. He was working for a company called Alessi, and he was incorporating that same kind of ideology that he had with the architecture into the pieces that he was doing. His stuff really was an influential part of this California Memphis style. And if anything, what we can see is that California Memphis style is really a reflection of what he was doing, what Michael Graves was doing as an architect on buildings. So, for example, we have this teapot that is shaped in a very triangular form, rather than as this domed, rounded half circle that we typically see as teapots. So he's pulling in these exaggerating the form of what the shape would be. Incorporating things like this that look like rivets at the bottom of the teapot that really don't serve any function, they're just there for decorative purposes. We recognize the arc of the circle there, that it really is the completion of a circle. And then just those little things that are added on that, again, serve no real purpose or are decorative purposes, like the little bird that goes at the nozzle of the teapot to sing out the scream of the teapot. And that was just like a little fanciful thing that adds an element of humor and a bit of irony into the design that's done here. So over and over again, Michael Graves was playing with this kind of idea of taking things that are normal, everyday things and reconceptualizing them in the same way that he was reconceptualizing architecture, adding things into them for the sake of adding them in, not because they served a purpose, but because they were fun. And eventually, he ended up doing products for Target. So if you go into a Target store, you're still going to see some of the products that you can buy at Target that were designed by Michael Graves, even though Michael Graves now has passed away. But Michael Graves did this because the companies like Alessi that he was working for, they were selling his stuff for like hundreds of dollars. And he decided somewhere along the line that good products should be available to everyone. So he said good design should be accessible to all. And that became his motto, and that was really kind of like the underlying current of what Target was about, trying to make sure that people had access to well-designed pieces. So that's what he started doing there. And then once he started doing it, then people started to capitalize on this aesthetic, this look. So other designers started to see what Michael Graves was doing as far as the three-dimensional objects, and started to try to put that, or to reinterpret that into two-dimensional aspects of what graphic design was. And once we saw that, then people started to get ideas and started to use this new stylistic quality in the designs that they were doing. As I mentioned, one of the groups that was doing this was called the Memphis Design Group. And the leader of the Memphis Design Group was this guy named Ettore Sottsass. He was an Italian. He had a long reputation as being kind of a bad boy in the design industry in Italy. He didn't like going by the rules, so whenever he worked on corporate identity projects, he was always like pushing the edge. He was kind of like the George Lois of Italian designers, so he was always seen as as a little bit radical. So when he formed the Memphis Design Group, he certainly decided that he wasn't going to follow the rules that everybody else was doing. Memphis Design Group was really interested, again, in furniture and household goods. So that's really where their influence came along. So at this time, what you were seeing were things that Michael Graves was doing for Alessi, or you started to see this Memphis Design Group and the furnishings that they did. So these are just a couple of iterations of what their logo looked like, but this is what their furniture looked like. So when we look at this, this was a room divider. And we can see that this is not your standard everyday room divider, that this is actually a pretty interesting piece of furniture all by itself. It was not meant to conform to any of the traditional ways that furniture was put together. It was meant to be, again, pulling out those very saturated colors that we'd seen in pop art and playing with the geometric forms that we'd seen in Swiss design, but now putting them together in a kind of crazy configuration. Here's another piece that was a sideboard. And so what Satsas was doing was he's, again, having this kind of reverence to things of the past, pulling them in, putting together hodgepodge manners of putting together furnishings that were kind of reminiscent of something else, and just doing it in this odd configuration that really didn't make a lot of sense to people, but did it because it was fun, because he could. Same reason that Michael Graves was designing buildings the way that he did, because he could, because it was fun, because it felt right to him. So in the case of Ettore Satsas, he turned this into not just, I'm doing it because it feels right, but because he wanted to make a statement. So the thing about these pieces of furniture, this hall table that he designed, is that although this looks like it's made out of marble and granite, it's not. It's actually made out of formica over plywood. So formica is a plastic that is bendable, and you just glue it down onto plywood or onto a wood surface. It's like a veneer. And it comes in all kinds of different finishes. And so Ettore Satsas said, okay, well, I'm just going to take the formica that's available that looks like marble, and I'm going to cover it over top of this plywood, and it's going to look really, really rich. It's going to look really, really fanciful and elite, but it's really just plastic. And so what he's doing is he's making a statement about this new era, and this is coming out in the 1980s, around the same time that Ronald Reagan was coming to the forefront as president, where this attitude of new richness and getting rich fast, the same time that the movie Wall Street came along, where the catchphrase or the question was, how many yachts do you actually need to sail behind, or to water ski behind, came along, and the answer is no, it's never enough. So for those folks that were trying to get rich, they were all about this newness of their richness and showing off their wealth, their richness. And so it was all about the surfaces and the superficial side of being rich. And it's like, okay, I can wear diamonds, but does that change the personality that I am? And in truth, these folks were no different from anybody else. They just had a lot of money to spend. To the point that the style, this California style, became very popular among that group of people. It became an emblem for them to capitalize on this California Memphis style, and they were all buying it up. And so Ettore Satsas, kind of laughing behind his hand, was going, fine, that table cost $5,000. It's plastic. It's plywood with plastic laminate over top of it, and people were buying stuff like that at $5,000 a pop because he could. And so that was really the mockery that was going on with this kind of style. They were actually poking fun at that new richness, at the attitude of people at that time about being so rich, so affluent that they could afford to spend money on stuff like this. And so over and over again, Ettore Satsas was playing with this idea of plasticity and making things that looked like who knew what. There was just a bunch of shapes that they were putting together that didn't even really imply what the function of this was. You can see here that these are actually just a series of candlesticks, but they certainly don't look like your standard traditional candlesticks. Others started to play off of this idea too, where they were taking these superficial textures, patterns, and incorporating them on, again, very simple plastic pieces or just wood that's cut out into shapes. Robert Venturi was an architect who was doing this, and he did a whole series of chairs that were fashioned after, in some ways, after historical chairs, but then just painting the surfaces. So this is a plywood chair that is painted into a chintz pattern, and it's supposed to represent the stylings of a Queen Anne style chair. Again, these chairs sell for moolah bucks, and sold for moolah bucks, and they all went out to these people that were a part of this era. In California, a group called the Michaels started to become really popular, and this is part of the reason why it was called the California style, because visually, graphically, the work of the Michaels was really the part that people paid attention to, and so they were taking these ideas of shapes and simplistic, or these bright, bold colors, and this idea of repetitious patterns that we saw with Michael Graves, and they were incorporating them into new designs. And so these Michaels, especially Michael Vanderbilt, became kind of the cult leaders for what this California style looked like at that time. And again, we can see some of the things that April Bryman was doing, where she was, using the scribble effect, or incorporating photographs into the pieces that that she was doing. But these guys are incorporating this idea of the serif typefaces now, and being a little bit more clean aesthetically, more grid-like aesthetically, as they started to develop their designs. So ultimately, I like to think of this California style as one that is kind of like New Wave, but with a more elegant approach to it than what New Wave was. Probably the last slide a couple of slides that I have to show you here that represent this California style came from a woman named Deborah Sussman, who designed the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. And it was really the work that Deborah Sussman did, and accompanied by what the Michael Vanderbilt were doing, that really came to make this called the California style. Because the Los Angeles Olympics obviously was in California. And Deborah Sussman, again, being a cultural leader, was aware of this new trend towards this new style of postmodernism, which, again, they didn't really have a name for quite yet. But what she did was she developed the entire branding program for the Los Angeles Olympics based off of this style, this Memphis style. The only thing that she had at that point was the logo when she took on this project. That was the Stars and Olympic Rings logo. And the problem with this particular Olympics was that it was riddled with problems financially. This was right after the 1980 Olympics. Jimmy Carter had been our president, and he had decided that we were going to boycott that Olympics because of the Russians selling arms to Afghanistan. And so we were boycotting it in protest to what the Russians had done. And so the United States didn't participate in that Olympics. And a lot of people were really upset with the United States bowing out of a very, very big Olympic event. Especially our poor Olympians who had actually trained to be in that Olympics, and then to find out within that year that all of their work that they had done for 4 years leading up to that was fruitless. In any case, people were not happy about that whole situation, and so they were looking forward to the 1984 Olympics. However, the international Olympic committees were not very fond of the United States at this point, and so they refused to give money to help out with the Olympics. And so when Deborah Sussman stepped into the situation, they were really, really behind on where they should have been for the graphic program and all the buildings and all the stuff that went into the Olympics. And so they had to figure out a way to make these Olympics work on a shoestring budget. So Deborah Sussman chose to create a palette that was very, very simplistic as far as colors. So she chose these very bright, stunning colors to work with. She chose a palette of stars and stripes, essentially using this whole color palette that she had developed here, and integrated them over and over again in the things that she did. And then on top of it, she, because she didn't have much money to spend on things like Olympic Park and stuff like that, she had to find ways to build these parks without actually building real architectural structures. So instead she used scaffolding. Like the scaffolding that you would use to construct a building, you would put it on the skin, on the outside of the building, as you're putting up the sheetrock or the curtain wall system. And so she ended up using that kind of scaffolding, spray painting it bright colors, and then applying the graphics in a superficial way as plywood over top of the scaffolding structure. And so it made it so that the whole thing was portable. You could take it down. You could use a site that you didn't actually have to procure. You could rent out that venue for a month or so, and then erect these structures. And then people could walk around them. And she was able to do this on a really very small budget as compared to what it was. And so it was very, very successful as far as trying to find a way to work this. And the success of this program is really the reason why a lot of people started to pay attention to this California Memphis style, and really it caught on even more after that and became utilized even more by a lot of people after this period. Any questions on either New Wave or California Memphis style? Okay, so the next version of postmodernism that we want to look at is called retro. Some people call it hipsterism. I think that term is already passé. So hipsterism's kind of gone by the wayside, and I only call it hipsterism because there was a while where, this group of people felt like they had invented this, and it's like I laugh at it because this was back in the 1980s when postmodernism, postmodern retro came along. So certainly was not an invention of the 2010s like so many other people thought. The influence here was really based upon what Pushpin was doing, and especially from the reference that Pushpin was making towards history. It was backwards looking at past design trends, but doing them with a modern twist. And really, the other part of this was an appreciation for everyday objects and references, so what we would call quotidian or ephemeral. Those things were really taken advantage of in the retro movement. That means that things like, telephone books or instruction manuals or industrial, products like those signboards that you find in front of in your dentist's office. All of those things, those were fodder for the retro fashion. And then there was kind of a fusion of styles that reference the nostalgic past, but they're integrating with modern design trends. So it's really an interesting kind of approach that retro plays. And in fact, the observation assignment that you guys have been doing has really been an exercise in retro, because all we've been doing is looking at trends of the past and finding a modern day interpretation. And that's really what retro is about, finding things from the past and finding a modern day interpretation. So let's look at some retro, because you guys have in this exercise, but let's look at the tastemakers, the change makers that really were the ones that led us in that direction. First one that we want to appreciate is a woman named Paula Scher. Paula Scher is a designer. She's actually married to Seymour Klost of Pushpin, so she definitely is influenced by the Pushpin studio. But even before she was married to Seymour Klost, she found that what the Pushpin studio was doing was really exciting and fresh. She went to school at Taylor School of Art, and she found that she kept on going back to the idea of using letterpress type or rub down type or Helvetica. She kept on calling on those, and she realized somewhere along the line that she could actually use typography in a way that was a reference to the past, or that could be illustrated out a little bit more. And when she started to do that, then this whole idea kind of took off for her. So in looking at this particular poster that she did for a conference on computer networking that came out in 2000. She took images left over from old advertisements showing hairnets and referencing that to networking. And so the image here looks very much like it would if you were to find an old advertisement from the 1930s, 1940s. The colors are very familiar, similar to that, and the whole idea of the gradient is very reminiscent of what A.M. Cassandra was doing. But the image-wise, it's very populist kind of image that's being done there. But if we look at it again, we start to notice, oh, the typography is very modern typography. The date certainly is a modern date. And some of the things that are being done, like turning type sideways, that's right out of the New Wave fashion. So she's pulling in things from the past, but then she's doing a modern interpretation, reinterpretation of them, and creating a new variation of them. And that was kind of new to a lot of people. They hadn't really seen that kind of thing before Paula Scher came along. Her background is that she, out of school, when she graduated from school, she ended up working at CBS Records, and this was before we had DVDs and CDs and all of that stuff. So albums were still around at that time, and that was how records were sold, off of albums. And so as an art director for CBS Records, you'd think that you'd have all this creative freedom, all this creative liberty, because you're working on a creative field. Music, by all means, is very forward thinking. And yet, what the truth of this was that as an art director, all of the art directors at CBS were given a limited budget. They were told, you are allowed to spend this much money per year. You can spend it any way that you want. Most of the designers just chose to break that money down and say, okay, if I've got $100,000 and I've got 10 projects I'm working on, it's $10,000 per project. That's my budget. That's how I'm going to work. Paula Scher decided that she didn't want to work that way. She decided that in some cases, she thought, I can do this for a lot cheaper than $10,000. In other cases, she might say, I've got a series of photo shoots that I want to do, and I need $25,000 for photography for this. And so she decided that she was going to ration her money out in ways that made more sense depending upon what the project was. So in this particular case, for a best of collection that was left over from the jazz era in many regards, she decided that she was going to do it all typographically. So rather than referencing, taking pictures of all these different jazz musicians or all these different artists, she decided that she was going to do a typographic solution. And she started to go backwards to historically and say, okay, when was the Jazz Age? Well, the Jazz Age was around the same time that constructivism was about, so she pulled in constructivism. It was the same time that Art Deco was around, and so she started to pull in typography that was kind of reminiscent of Art Deco. She looked at it and she said it was the same time when Futurism was coming about, and so she added in some little elements of Futurism into this and put this whole thing together in an interesting montage that says none of those things, but it also has reference to all of those things. So you can start to look at this and you can say, okay, I can see type that might reference Art Deco. I can also see stuff that is reminiscent of wood type posters in this. And so there's this kind of whole, all-around reference to historical past in this poster that's really done in a way that was fresh and new for that period of time. So Paula Scher really started to take off in doing things like this, where she was able to start to use typography, illustrate it in ways that were referencing times of the past. And she didn't just stop with typography, she did it with images as well. So this poster got her into a lot of trouble. You guys recognize this poster? This is Herb Matter's poster, left over from the 1930s or so, when he was working for the Swiss National Tourist Bureau. When Paula Scher was commissioned to do a poster, after she worked at CBS, she went out on her own, formed her own business. Now she works at Pentagram Studios in New York. But she went out on her own. One of the first jobs that she took on was she was commissioned by a company called Swatch, which made watches, cheap watches, inexpensive watches. but they were fun. They were fun watches because what Swatch would do is they would change out their watch faces every month or so. So you could buy a whole new collection of Swatch watches every month if you wanted to. And they would have 6 or 8 different watch faces come out with each different iteration. So in the course of a year, there might be several hundred of these Swatch watches. And the goal for a lot of folks, because they were cheap watches, they were about $30 each, because they were inexpensive watches, was you buy one and you dispose of it, you know, later on down the line. But people actually started to collect them, and they started to wear 2, 3, 4 watches at a time. That became kind of the fashion. So Swatch was really kind of a big deal. And Paula Scher decided when she was hired by Swatch and they asked her to design a poster for their company that she was going to take advantage of the idea of Swiss thinking as far as what timepieces are, because the Swiss are famous for being on time, for being and for having the best clocks around, and so that's what she was trying to say. And in reverence to that, she looked back at one of the masters of Swiss design, of design in Switzerland, and that was Herbert Matter. So she looked at his tourist bureau posters, and she decided to do a riff on that, to the point that her poster is almost, you know, very identical to what he had done in his original poster. You can even see parts here that are pretty much the exact same thing that she picked up. The face is a little different. This incorporation of, you know, this and this are the same, but this little character down here is the same. And so, and part of it too was that the Swatch logo was very reminiscent of the Swiss flag. That was part of what inspired her. But in any case, she got into a lot of people. People said, plagiarism. Anybody here think this is plagiarism? I mean, look at the way that the layout is working. Look at the way that, you know, it's like, okay, there's not a whole lot different between them. So people looked at this and said plagiarism, and there were a lot of people that screamed about this. However, it's not. And the reason why it's not, she contacted Herb Matter and said, I want to do a riff on your poster. Is that okay with you? And he said, yeah, sure, go at it. And so she had his permission to go ahead and use his original poster to do this riff. So not quite plagiarism. But all the same, a lot of people looked at this, and there were a lot of people that said, oh, retro is just a ripoff. It's plagiarizing people, the work of people in the past. It's not. This particular poster caused a lot of flack. Regardless, Paula Scher came to a lot of people's attention for her reverence to the past and to playing off of things that she was seeing other designers doing. So when she was hired by Public Theater to design a series of posters for their public performance shows, she took advantage of this idea of using things from the past. So here is a play that's about a boxer, and she decided to take advantage of pop art, so we can see that kind of Roy Lichtenstein kind of background going on with the dots and the moires, but this also kind of feels like Bradbury Thompson's posters or work when he was doing the stuff for Westvaco. And then the typography, again, is kind of constrained in this format that's a little bit like wood type posters in the way that's constrained. Here, this one, for Bring on the Noise, Bring on the Pump, Bring on the Funk, is more like Dada in many regards. We can see the idea of cutout forms. We also have typography that is being used in a futurist manner, where it's being used like pattern poetry. But again, we have this idea of the wood type kind of contains spaces that the type is falling into. And so again, we got this hodgepodge, this kind of conglomeration of all these different styles all happening at the same time in what she's doing. And then another person besides Paula Scher that was very influential in this retro movement was a guy named Charles Spencer Anderson. And Charles Spencer Anderson was a young designer working at an agency in Minneapolis at the time. For a while, people associated this whole retro movement with Minneapolis. It became the Minneapolis style for a short span until others like Paula Scher came to more prominence, more people started to use this. But in the case of the Duffy Group, they were located outside of in Minneapolis, and Charles Spencer Anderson was an employee there. And so a lot of the early stuff they attributed to the Duffy Group, not so much Charles Spencer Anderson, until they realized who he was and what he was doing. The first project that this shows up on is for a pasta sauce called Classico Pasta Sauces. It's still on the shelves these days. The jar has changed a little bit, doesn't quite look like this, but it was a very fresh, innovative idea at the time. So when this came out, Classico Pasta Sauce was a startup company. They didn't really have a whole lot of money to spend. Most pasta companies at that time, some makers of sauce like Ragu, were doing things that were really not very tasteful, if you will. They were doing things like, okay, let's put spaghetti in a white bottle, or let's put it in a can, or let's disguise it so that you can't really see what the product is inside the jar. They would put these, blue labels on a spaghetti jar. So it didn't look like the product. Now, we have Charles Spencer Anderson to thank for the way that we approach spaghetti sauce, among other things, for the way that it's packaged. Charles Spencer Anderson and the Duffy Group said, you're peddling sauce, you want this to look like something that is homemade. You want people to feel like they've got something tasty, that this is going to be a delicious product. We shouldn't spend our money on reinventing a jar. That would be silly. How about if we just make this as simple as possible and make it seem like it is something that is made authentically? What's more authentic than Grandma's cooking, right? So let's put it into the same kind of jars Grandma would use, which are mason jars, to the point that the jars actually say Mason across the side of them. They are real mason jars that they used for the packaging. And then what they did for the labels, simple label, just a simple die cut that had to be done, but they chose an image that was kind of evocative of wood type imagery. They used a beautiful classic serif typeface that they were using, that they incorporated into it, and just by incorporating these two things, this classic illustration style with the classic typography, doing something that was a little bit on the extreme by having the zigzag pattern that went around it, it still looked like something that felt authentic, felt like Grandma would make it. And so when people saw this on the shelves, this was new. People hadn't been exposed to this. They were used to these white jars with blue labels on it that was supposed to sell spaghetti sauce. And when they saw this, they were buying them off of the shelves, not because they knew that the sauce was good, but because it looked good. And they could, for a while, they couldn't keep these on the shelves. So Classico took off as a result of it, got the Duffy Group its name. From that point forward, Charles Spencer Anderson and Joe Duffy ended up working on a lot of projects together, so they ended up redesigning the labeling for Ralph Lauren, came up with a new logo that was used, and the ideas really came from the collection of stuff that Charles Spencer Anderson had been collecting since he was a kid. He used to have collections of Boys Life magazine from back in the days when he was a Boy Scout, and he had images that he would find in old woodcut books from way back when, and he just kept on collecting these things, and then he recycled them into the designs that he was doing, incorporating the old imagery, and that even looked like it was rubber stamped, and then just using new kinds of borders and patterns around the outside edges to make it look more interesting, more vibrant, and fresher looking. The same thing happened when Charles Spencer Anderson, when he finally went out on his own, and he was hired by Fossil Watches, which is a competitor to Swatch. Again, inexpensive watches, $30 a piece. Watch face is a little bit different, but these ones are a little bit more staid than what the Swatch watches were. They only came out with like one new watch per month. But in the case of this, people were buying these because they liked the packaging. The watches actually came in tin cans like this, and people liked that aspect of it, and were buying it more for the packaging than for the actual watch itself. Charles Spencer Anderson still is around today. He's still in Minneapolis, and now what he does is he does collections of all these kinds of clip arts. So you can go to his company, you can buy his clip art collections, and you can use them for your own version of retro kind of graphics that he showcases over and over again in the pieces that he sells. He also does all of the promotion pieces for French papers. So among all the paper companies that are out there, French Papers is still using the work from Charles Spencer Anderson left over from the 1990s when he came to prominence. Last person I want to talk to you about is Tibor Kalman, and I have to take this to Wednesday's class as well. But Tibor Kalman was a designer that was really very unique as far as design goes. He was Hungarian, but came to the United States and started to become a designer here in the U.S. He was also a rabble-rouser. Among bad boys of design, he was definitely one of those bad boys. And it wasn't because he did bad designs, it was that he just kind of had nothing good to say about the design community at that time. For example, he was one of those people that made the biggest stink about Paula Scher and what she had done for the Swatch watch ad. So he called her out on that and made a big deal about it. But in the case of Tibor Kalman, what he really liked to do was he liked to poke fun at things that already existed. So in that respect, we call him a retro designer because he is mocking things that already exist in society. Like, for example, the clouds on the inside of this umbrella are actually reminiscent of the paintings that you might see by René Magritte, where he's got a man standing on a blue background. Can't see his face, you can see him holding an umbrella, a black umbrella like this with a sky that's filled with blue clouds like this. The things that he liked to play with were these things that we would call quotidian or ephemeral pieces. So when we look at what he did for Restaurant Florent, which is a restaurant in New York City, he was their patron designer. And we look at the exterior of the building right here. And it still exists today, the building, down in the warehouse district of New York, which is now really hot as far as a district for selling things and so on. And the exterior of the building looks like an old rundown diner. In fact, it almost looks like it says "For Rent" in the window, except that it doesn't say "For Rent." It's got a little L placed between the F and the O, and there's if it was "For Rent," you're missing an R in there, so it's Restaurant Florent. That he did this to, but he purposely wanted this building to look like a rundown kind of diner. At the same time, when you start to look at it and you start to digest what this menu is, you got many dishes on here that are upwards of over $20 for things like a sandwich. So it's a high-end kind of restaurant in a very low-rent kind of looking place. The restaurant itself very much looked like a diner. He had checkerboard floors, linoleum checkerboard floors, and tables that were pretty much like your standard diner type of tables. But the menu itself was filled with things like croque madame or creme brulee or a roasted chicken or whatever. It was like a really high-end kind of restaurant. Food-wise, really excellent food staff, but the exterior of the place looked really kind of run down. And so he would have things like, these boards that would sit at the front door and welcome people into the restaurant and tell you what the daily special was. And they all looked like they were cheesy, things that you would see in these old-style restaurants or old-style kinds of establishments that were not high class. But the restaurant itself actually was high class. Over and over again, he was always pushing what the norms were. So it looked like one thing, but it was really another thing. We're going to have to stop right there. We're going to pick up with more of Tibor Kalman on Wednesday class. Are there any questions on any of this yet?